What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time?
All right, let's bring him in. David, Cote, I told you as we're getting ready to prepare, Dave, you make me feel like this feels like family to me, because when I see my younger brother on video chats, he's always smoking a cigar. And so it makes me feel like home. And as we connect, I see you with a big stogie. It makes me feel good, man. So welcome to the Learning Leader Show. It's great to have you.
Nice to be here. It's not a habit I advocate, but I do enjoy it, especially if I'm fly fishing, I got to admit.
I think you've earned it. It is great to talk to you. I mean, your background, I'll have to tell you, man, preparing for this episode for me was a joy and a treat to read through your background, your book. For those on video can see it here. Winning Now, Winning Later, a lot of things to get to. But first, Dave, I love when I get to learn from a fascinating teacher and leader like yourself to understand their vision and view of excellence, specifically people in their life who they've seen sustain excellence over an extended period of time. And when you analyze those people as well as yourself, what have you found to be some of the commonalities among leaders who have sustained excellence?
Well, believe it or not, I actually put a fair amount of time into thinking about that when we were going through our transition process at Honeywell. Mm-hmm. Because in picking your successor CEO, you want somebody who can build upon what you did and keep it going. And that's not easy to do. You see a lot of transitions just don't work out that well. So I spent months and years really trying to think that thing through. And at one point, I had a list of like a page and a half, single-spaced, of all the characteristics that were important. And I realized that if I was trying to pick a successor based on that, then I'd start to put them on a scale of 1 to 5, and then you'd add them up and then average them, and you'd have someone at 4.2 and someone at 4.3. And I realized that just wasn't going to work. So I spent a bunch more time thinking about it and boiled it down to 6. 6 items, which I also included in a share owner's letter to be able to explain. So the first item was just an intense desire to win. And there's too many people, smart people, who can explain why something didn't happen. There aren't quite as many who encounter an obstacle and then figure out what the hell are they going to do about it, rather than just go to their boss and say, well, here it is, boss, but rather figure it out and get to a solution, find a way around the obstacle, above it, through it, whatever you're going to do. But they just wanted to win so badly that they were going to drive themselves and their organization to win. Second one, just basic intelligence and good analytical ability, because it's too easy to just take what other people tell you or what you read and then kind of follow the herd, which will get us into the second point, but a third point. But what I wanted was someone who could look at data themselves and observe things going around and come to a conclusion, which gets us into the third one, which is the ability to think independently. And there's a phrase I use a lot that says the ability to think independently is a lot more rare than being smart. There's all kinds of smart people, great educational backgrounds, and what they can tell you is in detail how the herd is thinking. But there's a phrase, I didn't make it up, that I always liked, that's called fad surfing. And you'll run into plenty of leaders who can, whatever the latest fad is, whatever's in the press, whatever investors want to talk about, they can be incredibly knowledgeable about that fad. But not all fads turn into reality. So you need somebody who can think independently, look at all the data, come to their own conclusion, not worry about consensus, but be able to make an informed decision. The fourth one was just an intense curiosity. Because there's a lot of people who can be successful in the first 2 or 3 years of a job. If you're going to be successful over a long period of time, you have to just be intensely curious about everything. What's going on in your organization? What are competitors doing? What's happening in markets? What's happening in countries? You just got to be interested, curious, want to know, want to figure it out. The fifth one is, sorry, I'm going to need my glasses a bit here now, Ryan. Excuse me. The fifth one is just courage. Mm-hmm. And especially when you're in difficult times like we are now, leaders can become paralyzed, and they either just follow the herd because that's easier. They drive like hell to get consensus because then that's what makes them feel comfortable about their decision. And at a time like this, for example, you're not always going to get consensus. So what you have to be able to do is think independently, come to a conclusion that makes sense, and have the courage of your convictions when you make the decision. Now, interestingly, at the same time, and this is what I oftentimes refer to as ability to do two seemingly conflicting things at the same time, when you make that decision and you've had the courage to make that decision, the organization can't sense any ambiguity from you. Organizations don't handle ambiguity well. So you have to be confident in how you portray your decision and why. But at the same time, you need to constantly be looking over your shoulder for, was I right? And I call that, again, I'm not making this up. I've gleaned this elsewhere, but it's still very true. You need to be looking for falsification bias, not confirmation bias. And too many people, when they make a decision, everything they see afterwards confirms that it was the right decision, whether it's a new product, employee policy, or whatever, a strategy, whatever it is. But you need to be looking over your shoulder instead for what are those things that would indicate it's not working the way you think it is. And that's that falsification bias. The last, of course, is one that everybody talks about, and that's just the ability to motivate a large organization and build a strong culture. Because you're not going to perform well over a long period of time unless you've built a culture that supports what it is you're trying to do. So those are the 6 items, and that's how we chose my successor.
You got promoted to become the CEO of Honeywell in 2002. The company was described as a train wreck at the time.
Yeah.
And before we get into some of the things you did at Honeywell, and Dave, you and I talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but one of the things that I am asked about from people via email are ways for them to get promoted or ways for them to get the job that they want. So I always like to analyze when someone gets a big job like becoming the CEO of Honeywell, even if it was a train wreck at the time, I like to analyze how. And I'm curious from your perspective, why do you think they chose you to be the CEO of Honeywell in 2002?
Well, they chose me at the time. This one where I got to be pretty honest, because they were desperate.
Mm-hmm. But there were other candidates, I assume. I don't know about the interviewing process. I have to imagine when there's a job like that, there were other candidates, and there's something that you did that made the decision makers choose you versus anybody else in the world.
Yeah. It's not going to be the answer you're looking for, because
I just want the true answer. It doesn't matter what it is, because I think it's helpful.
Well, others had already turned down the job.
Okay.
And because the company had been in a tremendous amount of trouble for 4 years, $8 billion in write-offs, a merger and an acquisition that hadn't been integrated. Company was sold to United Technologies, then sold to GE, then that deal fell through. One CEO leaves, a former CEO comes back. So they were not, I was not an obvious choice. And when I was, I can say this was actually on TV. Reporters were talking about, we're not sure this company can be turned around. And if it can, we're not sure this is the guy who can do it, because he didn't make it to the first tier in the GE succession race, and he wasn't even the first choice to run Honeywell. So this is one where they were kind of looking for somebody willing to take the job. And this is where I tell people, hardly anybody remembers any of this. Mm-hmm. But I always tell people, don't worry about how the opportunity comes to you. When you see a great opportunity, don't let your ego get in the way of, I wasn't the first one asked, or I don't like the way I was asked. Look at it instead and say, okay, is there an opportunity here for me to distinguish myself? And if there is, take it. Don't sweat all that stuff, because if you do perform, over time, it doesn't matter. Nobody remembers it, just you. So hardly anybody remembers this part of the story except for me, because I was living it.
Well, I think there's a good learning there for people is that you viewed it without an ego and viewed this train wreck as an opportunity, as a way for you to implement your beliefs and your behaviors into a place where things are going really bad and potentially change it for the better. And that's the power of leadership. That's why leadership's so important. And I think that mindset, maybe you can expand on that, of what you were thinking at the time. That mindset is something that could be useful for all of us as we're progressing, that sometimes the job that people don't want. I remember Carly Fiorina said it on this podcast. She said, run towards the fire. Run towards the problem. How did she become the first woman CEO of a Fortune 50 company? Because she was always willing to run directly towards the fire. And Honeywell in 2002 was on fire, and you ran towards it. So maybe you could share your mindset in that regard.
Well, interestingly, it's an interesting analogy, because Honeywell was on fire, and only when you got close to it and saw it from the inside did you realize the fire was significantly worse than anybody could perceive from the outside. So that was interesting. And I want to make sure I come back to kind of one of your first questions, which was, okay, so how do you advance?
Yep.
And I guess a couple of points that I'd make there is the first one is you have to perform. And I was a big believer in telling people where you went to school, how well you did in school, that gets you your first job. After that, none of that really matters, shouldn't matter. What matters is, do you perform? Do you perform better than your peers, better than your plan, better than last year? You've got to be able to perform, and perform consistently. The second one is it requires visibility. And you have to be willing to take that visible job. And yeah, sometimes that means taking some risk, because if you take a very visible job and you fail, it's going to hurt like hell. But you got to be willing to take that chance. And if you perform really well and people see it, makes a big difference. The second piece of that I would say is, if you want to continue to advance in a career, I would always tell our leadership classes, and I would talk to, I'd say 2 or 3 leadership classes a month. And I would say there's 2 things if you want to consistently advance. One of them will sound familiar, because it's, you got to be able to get results. Mm-hmm. And you got to be able to get them in the right way. Right way as in, they're sustainable, and there aren't a bunch of dead bodies around you that you made the numbers, but you burned the place to the ground to get there. The second one I would tell them is much tougher, and only they can do it. And that's that they have to be self-aware and they have to be a learner. And this is especially true for, I'd say, younger people who are coming up in an organization, because if you do well and perform, you get great appraisals. There'll be 2 or 3 things that they'll mention that you need to do better. Generally, you'll ignore those because you figure that, okay, they just don't understand me, or they just don't realize who I am. And if you perform well, you can ignore those for a long period of time. But at some point, you end up truly being faced with, okay, I do have some things that I need to address if I'm going to be successful as a leader. And I'll tell them, you all get 360s. As they would come into the course. I was not a big believer in doing them widespread, but rather wanted to make sure we did them for these courses. And I'd say, you'll look at all the strengths and say, absolutely, man, they really know me. I am that good. Then you'll look at the issues, and you generally have 2 reactions. One is, gee, they clearly just don't understand what it is I'm trying to do. Or 2, they'll say, I know who the son of a bitch is who said that. And the thing they need to do is start to put all of this, strengths and issues, into a 4 block. And I used to call it good advice, bad advice. I take the advice, I reject the advice. Because not everything you hear in an appraisal or 360 is going to be correct. So you have to figure it out and maximize, obviously, the good advice you take and the bad advice you reject. And it's a learning process, and it's painful. And I would tell them I went through the same thing myself. I said, from the time I got my first appraisal, I'd be told, Dave, you can be defensive at times. And I think that my first response to that would be, no, I'm not, without kind of recognizing the irony of that in the beginning. Then I got a little smarter about it and came up with more words to explain why I wasn't defensive. And it took until, I'd say I was almost 40 years old. And I was in a meeting with my peers. And one of the guys made a comment about my organization, to which I responded pretty aggressively. And the guy looked at me and says, geez, Dave, don't be so defensive. And I thought, okay, this is an opportunity. I'm going to finally make it clear to everybody that I'm not. So I turned to another guy who was a friend of mine and said, well, geez, do you consider me defensive? And he looked around a little bit and says, no, not really. I wouldn't say you're defensive, but you know, if we say something negative about your organization and it is not 100% correct, you will rip our lips off. As you could tell, that stuck with me. Yep. And I thought, okay, clearly this is something I need to address. So I had to start working on how do I do this differently? How do I get the facts and the opinions and not in a way that scares people off? And the second one I would share is that I'm decisive. Now, most people would say, well, wait a minute. If you're decisive, that's a great thing to have in a leader. Well, yes and no. If you're making decisions that are easily reversible and the consequences are small of being right or wrong, yeah, sure, being decisive is an advantage. But if you're making big decisions where the consequences are irreversible, well, you don't want to be quite as decisive. You want to spend time kind of just wallowing in the problem, agonizing over it. Are you truly making the right decision? Get all the facts and opinions. So in both cases, I had to modify my own leadership style in order to kind of guard against my own issues. And I'm convinced I wouldn't have accomplished what I did unless I'd been able to find a way to work with both of those. And it's important for everybody to figure out what are those things for them.
Talking about getting results, during your 16 years as CEO, you grew market cap you and your team grew market cap from 20 billion to 120 billion, I believe.
Yeah, I got to admit, I kind of like that.
I like that you just admit it. That's good. Yeah, you're not, hey, you got results.
I'm pretty proud of that, and I'm even more proud that it continues, even though I've been gone from there for a couple of years.
Well, I mean, that's level 5 leadership, right? It remains and gets better. You've set it up to be great even when you're not there. That's what the ultimate level of leadership is, and my belief is that you've set them on the proper trajectory, so that, and you've done the work to get the next leaders ready to go, as you've already talked about. So that part is just indisputable. I'm curious though, as part of that growth, you had to do a fantastic job of surrounding yourself with great people, and hiring is vital to this. And this is something that I work with leaders on a regular basis on them doing a better job of surrounding themselves with fantastic people. And we can zoom out and zoom in here. So one aspect of that is the process of making those decisions of who to bring on to your team. And as at the CEO level, I haven't been a CEO of a company like Honeywell before, so educate me. But I'm curious, what was it like inside the room when somebody was interviewing with David Cote, the CEO of Honeywell? What were you asking them? What were you looking for? What was the process for you to say, yes, I want her on my team. Yes, I want him on my team. I'd love for you to take us inside your mindset when it comes to the questions you ask, the qualities you're looking for as you made decisions of who to bring onto your team.
Well, the first thing I probably ought to admit is I don't consider myself a great interviewer. So I always figured it was something I was okay at, but I wasn't superb.
Mm-hmm.
However, my HR leader was superb. And I can't think of how many times we'd get done, we'd interview somebody, then we'd get together and compare notes. And he'd say something like, well, what'd you think? And I'd always start with, well, what do you think? I want to know what you think first. And I would have come to the conclusion, for example, when I got to the end of, yeah, I think so-and-so is a good person. We probably ought to hire him. That'd be the extent of my conclusion. Then my HR leader, a fellow named Mark James, would go through a list of like 10 items and say, well, here's why I think this person is a good leader. And I'd find myself nodding all the time saying, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I agree with that. Then he'd go into, here's the 3 things that I think are concerns. And he'd go through those and I'd say, yeah, you're right. I picked that up also. So it's like this guy was just tremendous at doing it. And I was not. So we made a very good team that way. And as you might imagine, the things I were looking for were the same 2 things that I mentioned earlier. Did they have a history of getting results and being able to make decisions, both good and bad? And were they self-aware and could they learn? So the questions I would ask, I'd usually ask, what do you consider your strengths? And not, hey, I did a great job here, I did a great job there, but what are the characteristics that make you a strong leader? Then I would go into the next one that says, okay, what are 2 issues you have that you need to guard against? And I'd say 75% of them would say something like, well, I'm impatient. I'd kind of listen to it a bit and I'd say, okay, we're all impatient. You wouldn't have got here unless you were, but that's not exactly an issue. So I really want you to think about what's your issue? What's the thing that you need to guard against? And they'd take some time to figure that out. And then I'd say, all right, what do you do to mitigate against it? How do you modify your behavior so that it's not an issue? And what I was looking for was somebody who I think sometimes they were looking at it as, oh, he's just trying to catch me here. And what I was really looking for was somebody who said, yeah, I do tend to be defensive at times. So this is what I do to guard against that. And I'd say the last thing I would look for, or another thing I would look for, is somebody who could change things, but also build upon what their predecessor had done. And I had this great conversation early on, and this is in the book, but I had somebody come in early on to interview for a division CFO job. And I was interviewing him, and it was in my hotel room, and I said, okay, what are you going to change? What are you going to do that's different? And he said, nothing. I thought my predecessor was great. I'm just going to keep doing the same stuff. And I said, okay, well, that's good. But because I want people to build upon things, because that's how you make an organization bigger and better. But what are you going to do differently? And again, he said, nothing. I like everything my predecessor did. So I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. Because I had a suite. I said, I'm going to go in the other room, and I'm going to be in there for 15 minutes. And when I come out, I want you to have written down 3 things that you're going to do differently that could be better. And you could see the look of panic on his face. And it's funny because the few times I've seen him since that time, he always brings it up. And he just panicked. And I said, okay, you understand? He said, yep. So I went in the other room, closed the door, and I thought, and I also told him, I said, if you don't have at least 3 good things, you don't get the job. So I waited 15 minutes, kind of curious to see what was going to happen. Walked back in the room, said, okay, what do you got? He had 11 items on the page that he was going to do differently, and all of them good. And he managed to do that in 15 minutes. So I think the organization kind of learned from that point on that when you came in for a job, you'd better be prepared to explain how you were going to build upon what your predecessor had done. By the way, he turned out to be absolutely terrific. He was a great CFO.
Interesting. The topic of your book, Winning Now, Winning Later, I was fascinated. I remember when your PR team reached out, because this is something that we see rampant within corporate America, which is some very bizarre behaviors can happen with the phrase, you don't understand, I have to hit the quarter. If I don't hit the quarter, and I'm talking CEOs, very senior level leaders, they basically live quarter to quarter. And if they miss a quarter, they're fearful, or they sometimes do get fired. Or even a senior sales leader, which is where the place that I played and when I was in corporate America is that. So your entire book and your kind of mantra and ethos is that you can do both. You can win now and you can win later. So when a CEO reaches out to you and says, Dave, yeah, maybe at Honeywell you figured it out, but that's just not how it works here. Good for you, but we have to really do some crazy things just at the quarter. And if we don't, then I get fired. So what is some of the advice you give to that person, that CEO? And I'm sure these conversations happen a lot. It's probably partially why you wrote the book, to say, no, you can win now and win later. You can take care of both the short term and the long term, as opposed to only thinking about the short term.
Well, there's a lot to talk about in there, so we can go into a number of directions, but I would start with the title of my first chapter, which is to banish intellectual laziness. And there's this, it's an old saying, I didn't make it up, but I've always loved it, that says, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, always expecting a different result. And if you keep doing things the way you did, then yes, you're going to keep running into that same problem. If instead you say success is the ability to accomplish two seemingly conflicting things at the same time, then, and short-term and long-term performance seems to be one of them, what do I do differently to make sure that I can actually do that? And if you are confronted with, hey, you either make this quarter or you get fired, make the quarter. You know, don't get fired, live to fight another day. But you should start the thought process that says, I don't want to keep living like this. Mm-hmm. And in my time, I don't know, I had like 60 or 64 quarters. I think we missed two, one because of the Great Recession and one because of the problems I ran into when I first got there. You start to say, okay, I need to think differently. Yes, I have to make the quarter. Mm-hmm. But two, I need to start doing the seed planting that's going to allow us to succeed in the future. And towards the end of my tenure, I used to get questions from investors about, geez, why are you able to make all these great numbers and none of your peers are? And I don't always say the same thing, is it has a lot less to do with what I'm doing today than what I did 3 to 5 years ago to set this up. So, one of the things that we always did is we'll say all my peers were committing to, on average, a 9% earnings increase. Well, I would commit to a 10% earnings increase, but I would have an internal plan that allowed me to get to 12%. And I would do that including having the seed planting money in there. So that if things didn't turn out like I expected or we had problems, I could still get the 10. And if we did achieve the 12, I would take 1 or 2 of those points and reinvest them in more seed planting and say, okay, I'm going to take that money to go forward. So
can you define seed planting real quick?
Oh, sure. It could be any kind of growth initiative. If you're running a sales team, it could be, I don't do any business with these 5 major accounts. I need to cold call them, find a way to get in there, and I need to devote time for me and for my people to start doing the groundwork so that someday I do get an order. It might mean I have 5 accounts where I only have 20% of their business. I'd like 80% of their business. I need to start going in there to start figuring out how to get there. And if you look at salespeople, they have a quota to make. We tend to think of salespeople as these gregarious extroverts. Sure, they'll talk to anybody on the street or go anywhere, don't mind making cold calls. For 90% of them, that's not true. They tend to have great relationships with these 7 accounts. And if they're struggling to make the quarter, they don't go to the new guy. They go to those same 7 accounts and try to get them to order just a bit more. And they do something like say, tell you what, if you place an order and take shipment in this last week, I'll give you 90-day payment terms instead of 45. I'll give you a 2% price reduction. I'll give you 3% reduction if you pay within 10 days. And they just kind of continue that same behavior. Instead of saying, okay, how do I do this seed planting where, to make a quarter, I may still have to do a little of that. But over time, I get myself out of it because that's just a bad dynamic for the sales guy, for the sales team, and for the business.
One of the things you've written about in chapter 5 is about building a high performance culture. And everyone, obviously, they see the title and they're like, that's what I want, Dave. I want to build a high performance. Of course I do. My culture is going to be high performance. We're going to have fun and we're going to perform. It's going to play a place where everyone's going to have fun and love working, and we're going to crush it. What are some of the keys? Because this is something you've actually done, and we're not just talking like hypothetical. These are real things you've done. What are some of the keys to building a high performance culture?
Well, the first thing is I never committed to anybody that their jobs would be fun.
Mm-hmm.
But I did say your jobs will be fulfilling because, maybe it's my New England heritage, but I always felt like work can be fulfilling. That 90% of people want to be able to go home at night and be able to brag to their spouse and kids about what they accomplished that day. There's this sense of accomplishment, fulfillment that you get from doing that. And I avoided all morale building exercises. And I got a number of people on my staff wanted to do that when I first got there. And they'd say, morale's really tough. We need a morale building program. And maybe it helps that I started as an hourly employee. And I said, nah, none of that stuff works. It makes leaders feel better. They'll put all kinds of attitude posters up and perseverance and all that kind of stuff. But I said, none of that really works. What really matters is people need to feel that they are part of something bigger than themselves that's successful. Yeah, like being able to say, I work at Honeywell and our performance is great. Our environmental track record is great. I'm doing well there. My 401k is doing great. And that's what builds morale. And it does. Kind of going back now to say, okay, so how do you get a high performance culture is first define what the culture is that you want. And it's one thing to say, I want a high performance culture. It's another thing to break it down so that people know, well, what the hell does that mean? And we broke it down into what we called our 12 behaviors. And we used to kind of joke that God only needed 10 commandments, but to fix Honeywell, we needed 12 behaviors. But it was part of a negotiation with my own staff about what we wanted to do. And I remember one staff member saying, why are we working on culture and behaviors when we have all these strategic issues that we need to address and make decisions on? And my comment was, well, I can make all the strategic decisions you want, but if nobody does them, it's really not going to make much of a difference. I'll feel better, but the organization is not going to make any progress. So first, define what it is you want, and then be relentless about its implementation. You need to talk about it everywhere. People need to be appraised on that basis. They need to see that leaders that don't act that way, even if they get results, don't get rewarded. They need to see that you act that way and that you make a difference that way. And when you talk about short-term, long-term, they can't see that as soon as a business runs into trouble, you start eliminating all those investments, which is kind of a go-to reaction for people. They also need to see that, for example, if you're trying to get out of this make the quarter at all costs mentality, that when confronted with those decisions and a business or organization or some of your people say, we're not going to make the quarter unless we do this. And whatever this is, if it's antithetical to the culture you're trying to build, they have to see that you don't do it. And I ran into a lot of painful decisions like that in the beginning, where businesses would say, I'm not going to make the quarter unless you let me do this. And anybody who was there would say, every time they saw me make the decision to say, don't do it. I don't care. I'd rather miss the quarter. I'd rather you find a way to get there without that. And if you miss it, you miss it. And of course, there are repercussions to that. But I don't want you doing this. We always found a way to make it, maybe not in that business, but I'd find other ways to get there that were still legit with what we were trying to get done. And over time, people see, yeah, that behavior won't be tolerated. I can't load distributors at the end of the quarter. I can't cut terms or price in order to get there. I can't cut a deal with a supplier where they make an upfront payment that I can book as income. But no, the boss actually acts that way. This is real. You do that enough over time, and you have to persevere. anybody who thinks that, okay, I've done culture this year, now I can move on to the next thing, ain't going to happen. You have to just be relentless about it, like we were for the 16 years I was there.
Can you compare and contrast for me? Okay. Your first promotion from individual contributor to manager, and then your promotion to becoming the CEO of Honeywell. Will you compare and contrast the differences between those two jumps in your career?
Yeah, that's a interesting question, because when I first got to Honeywell, and as I said, investors looked a bit askance at me, thinking that I wasn't going to be able to make it anyway. I got the question from one of them saying, geez, you know, at TRW, you had 75,000 people. Now you have 115,000 people. How are you going to manage that jump? And I told them, look, that's actually not that difficult, because I didn't know the 75,000. I'm never going to know the 115,000. You just can't. It's impossible to know. Mm-hmm. And I told them at the time, you know, the most difficult leap in my career was going from being an individual contributor to having 3 people. That was the toughest one, because that's where you have to learn a lot about how do you trust, how do you verify, all that kind of stuff. And I'd say that answer went over like a lead balloon with them, and they thought, okay, he clearly just doesn't understand.
Oh, okay.
In reality, you know, it didn't go over well at all, even though it was the absolute truth. And I tried to explain it a bit, and it never went anywhere. But the fact is, that is the toughest part, because if you're successful as an individual contributor, it's because you're doing everything yourself. You're responsible for yourself, picking the direction, making decisions, driving the result. You control everything. And if you've gotten promoted, it means it's because you were good at that. Well, all of a sudden, you've got 3 people working for you, sometimes doing stuff that you don't know anything about. And now you're having to oscillate between those people who say, you just have good people and delegate and, you know, let them do the work. And then on the other side, there's, well, people don't always do things exactly the way they should have. So how do you get into enough detail so that I understand it and I agree with the direction, but I'm not micromanaging the result? And I found that more difficult than going from 75,000 to 115,000, because you really have to learn a lot about yourself, your people. How do you run something? It's not that easy.
That's amazing. But I think also like refreshing for someone to hear, because I'm a firm believer. You know, I remember making that first leap from in a sales role, individual contributor, to now having my own team, and just making countless mistakes,
Yeah.
because you just don't fully grasp what it actually means until you're in the seat, until you're doing the job, and you have varying degrees of personalities and people that are coming to you with questions or even comments that you never would have anticipated about, like personal things, marriage and problems. And wait, why are you coming to me? I'm this young dude who doesn't know anything about what you're asking me, and now I'm supposed to know. It blew me away. So
you also find capabilities are very different. And there's some people who, you can trust 95% of what they do. Some where you're only going to trust 40%. And you also end up learning people respond differently. And I ended up learning, this one took me a little longer, because you have a tendency to look at everybody as being like you. And there were some people who all I had to say was something like, look, you know, you're capable of better work than this. And man, they would internalize that. They'd feel badly about it. I mean, they'd really focus on, okay, what do I do to do this differently? There were others where I ended up learning. I had to bring him into my office and I'd say, I'm hitting you with a 2x4. And I'm telling you, I'm hitting you with a 2x4 because you seem impervious to suggestion up to this point. So I want you to know that unless this changes, I'm going to replace you on Friday. And it took that kind of, let's say, comeuppance for them to finally internalize and go, oh, I guess he is serious about this. And people are very different. So, and there, there's obviously the continuum runs between them. And you end up having to learn a lot about, okay, how do I reach somebody? They might be a good performer, but if I need them to modify something, how do I reach them in a way that they will internalize? It sounds like a simple concept, and it is. Doing it requires a little bit of experience and judgment.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about the importance of being right at the end of the meeting, and I found that an interesting viewpoint, perhaps different when you shared the expansion of that. Could you talk more about why it's important for you as a leader to be right at the end of the meeting?
Well, this is where I guess being self-aware and a learner ends up being important, because I didn't really learn that lesson until I was about 50 years old. And I tended to be, I'm not a strong extrovert, but I'm on the extrovert side. And an extrovert tends to, in a meeting, propose, try to get some discussion going, and then come to a decision. Well, what I ended up learning when I first got to Honeywell, I couldn't trust my board and I couldn't trust my staff, 3 of whom had interviewed for my job. So it's like if I tried to do things the way I used to, it just didn't work, because there were immediately people who were against me because it was me who said it. There were a bunch of people who were for me because they just wanted to get along with the new leader. And there were a bunch of people who just wanted a decision and then, hey, I'll go ahead and do it. So I started running meetings differently and saying, okay, I'm not going to let people know what I think about an issue until I get all the facts and the opinions out. So I started putting a lot more effort into how do I get all the facts and opinions. And people would ask me what I thought, and I would say, I don't know what I think yet. Even though I did, I couldn't help it. But instead, I would just foster the discussion. And if somebody said something I disagreed with, I'd pursue it and say, well, geez, I think so-and-so might have that right. Why wouldn't that be right? And I'd spend time when people were talking, looking around the table to see, okay, what kind of body language or facial expressions were you getting? And then I would also call on people. And you find introverts and extroverts participate differently. Extroverts tend to want to speak up. Introverts, no matter how smart, tend to want to be asked. So I would make a point of asking everybody around the table, okay, well, what do you think about this? One of the tougher things is when somebody says something you agree with, not to jump in and say, oh, I think that might be it, but instead to contain yourself. Then once that was all done, I still wouldn't say what I thought, but instead I would begin with the most junior person in the room and say, what do you think I ought to do? And what's the first thing they do? They look at their boss. And their boss generally goes to intervene and answer for them. And I'd always say, no, I'll get to you. I want to know what this person thinks. So I'd put them on the spot. And I'd go around the whole table from the most junior to the most senior to ask, what do you think I ought to do? And as a result of that, I got I always describe making a decision as you're building a mosaic. It's not as pretty as a painting, but you're trying to take all the pieces and fit them in to come up with, okay, what's the right decision here? Then once I came to that mosaic and I'd heard from everybody, I would then say, okay, here's my decision, but then I would explain it. And I'd explain why people who might have said something that was against that would understand that I did hear them. Because too often people feel like, well, if you don't agree with me, it means you weren't listening. And I'd say, no, there's a difference between listening and agreeing. And I'd explain why I made the decision I did and that I did hear them, but that I disagreed for a particular reason. That, I think, makes people feel better. Mm-hmm. But they also learn from it. And they learn how you think and why you're making the decisions you are. I also think that over 16 years, people would also say that they were never criticized or hurt by anything they said at a meeting that disagreed with where I ended up or what it was I wanted to do. Now, because that's the only way you're going to continue to get that kind of great participation. But I kind of stumbled on this, and that's where I came up with this saying, your job as a leader is to be right at the end of the meeting, not at the beginning of the meeting, because as a leader, you don't get measured based upon were you right from the beginning. You get measured on, did you make a good decision? And anything that helps you to make a good decision is better. There's some ego hits you take from it because whatever you end up deciding to do, we'll say it was something that you thought was the right thing from the beginning. Well, somebody else in the meeting gets credit for that idea, even though you might have been in the same place. So you just have to say, okay, well, that's one of the small things in life. I'm not going to let it bother me. Because at the end of the day, you'll get measured on, did I make a good decision?
I've found when I'm in these meetings with the impressive leaders, some of the skills they've developed is the ability to take in a lot of information, then synthesize all of that in their mind, distill it down to its essence, share then their decision and the why after all that distillation and synthesizing it. And it is impressive to see this in action, because the preparation for it's tough, because you have to basically do it in real time. I think the best preparation, the best preparation is reps, right? It's like most things in life. It's a rep game. You know, you get the repetitions, you become better at it. But yep. I have to believe like that's what you spent a lot of time doing, right? Is synthesizing, distilling, and then sharing with an explanation that made sense to others, even if they didn't fully agree. They're like, wait a second, Dave, yeah, I could tell he's a smart dude. He's thinking this through. He has a deep understanding. Even if he didn't at the beginning of the meeting, he does now. Is that kind of how you felt going in and leaving meetings as a CEO?
I don't think you could have said it any better. That's exactly right. And it's a little more difficult in the beginning, and I was having to learn myself. And to your point, learning, okay, here's when I intervene, here's where I don't, here's how do I make sure that it's not coming across that this is where I'm leaning, and then being able to explain it at the end. Yeah, it's more difficult, like anything, like you said, it's more difficult the first few times you do it, because it's like you're having to concentrate on it. Over time, it gets easier. It just becomes the way you work, and everybody learns that around you, and the participation is easier. They all know they're going to be asked, so they're having to think in the meeting themselves, and that's what you want. So it becomes easier and easier, not just for you, but for the organization.
One more question from the book, Dave. Chapter 6 talks about having too many leaders. When can counterintuitive, makes sense. I know the book writing process. I've talked to my editor and publisher. Like, you can't just say the same things everybody else is saying. But I'm curious, why is it an issue if you have too many leaders?
Well, I got to start from the performance side first. As a $22 billion company, sales, we had 740 what were called leaders, a certain level and above. By the time I left, we were a $42 billion company, almost double the size, and we had 650 leaders. And when we had 740, we were considered lean by investors. Why did I continue to work it down? Two basic reasons. The first one everybody talks about, and you hear about a lot, which says, well, it adds a lot of costs, because if you hire a leader, they hire an executive administrator, they hire staff, and it adds cost. But I'd say the hidden cost is significantly greater than that more apparent cost. And that is that if you create a job and you hire somebody good in there, which you try to do, well, if you hire a really good person, they're going to find stuff to do that you look at and go, oh, that's really good. We should be doing that. Well, the work they come up with, they're not going to just do on their own. It's going to require the assistance of other leaders in order to do it. As a result of that, their work metastasizes, and it creates a bunch of internal work so that leaders are focused more on satisfying stuff internally instead of focusing externally on the customer. So yeah, there's a lot of things that you may look at and go, geez, that would be good to do. But somebody is actually having to prioritize instead and saying, okay, I work 60 hours a week. I got 90 hours worth of work. Well, how do I prioritize and just do the stuff that is truly important? And you have to get that done at the same time you're trying to drive major initiatives. And you'll say, I need somebody in charge of this, which will be true, because if you're trying to get something new done, it does require an injection of bureaucracy. But everybody knew that when they were doing that, I'd also be looking at them and saying, okay, so where are you going to reduce a leader in order to fund that? How are you going to, because organizations develop a certain inertia, and however things were is how they're going to want to continue. And they never really look at it and go, well, geez, I have two leaders doing these two things. I really could combine those two into one leader. And instead, I'll put somebody else over here in charge of this. And as a result of that, you just end up with a better dynamic overall and people focused externally where you want them on the customer.
Gotcha. This is fascinating, Dave. It flew by. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, you asked good questions, so it makes it a little easier.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It means a lot coming from you. Where would you send our viewers and listeners to learn more about you online?
Well, probably LinkedIn is probably the best place now. I've got a site on LinkedIn, and my publisher, HarperCollins Leadership, has a separate site on LinkedIn. And so that's probably the best place. And we've been posting stuff, videos, and other things that hopefully people will find interesting.
Yeah, this is the book here for video, Winning Now, Winning Later, which I highly recommend. You see my copy's kind of beat up here, but how companies can win in the short term while investing for the long term, which caught my eye because I've seen for so long, Dave, and I know it's a real challenge, a problem of just this desperate need to win in the short term. And I'm just more of a long game player when it comes to relationship building in my work. And if I work with a client, I plan to work with them forever. That's just how I want to work. I think it's more, it's more fulfilling, as you've said, to work with people like that. And I think that's what this book can help with, and just following your work online. It's been a pleasure just preparing and then having this conversation with you, Dave.
Well, I'd say, right. And it also looks like the book is beat up because you read it, not because your dog got to it. So that's very encouraging.
I don't have a dog yet, although my family is really pushing me to get one now. But yes, so we beat it up. I appreciate. I know we will at some point, I'm sure. I appreciate you said it, and Dave, I really would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, man.
It'd be fun. I'd enjoy it.
All right, thanks so much.
All right, take care, Ryan.
All right,
thanks.
You too. Okay.